Welcome to the Right to Reason podcast. I'm your host, Robert Stanley, reading from Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching. You might dream that you're drinking fine wine, then the next morning you're weeping and sobbing. You might dream that you're weeping and sobbing, then the next morning you're out on a rollicking hunt in the midst of a dream. We can't know it's a dream. After we awake, we know it's a dream, but only after a great awakening can we understand that all of this is a great dream. Today, we are joined with a historian and a psychologist to discuss the history of human consciousness.
It's the Right to Reason podcast.
This episode of the Right to Reason podcast is brought to you by our patrons and contributors like me. We have all recognized the value of the unrestrained marketplace of ideas and have decided to make a difference. You can make a difference too. Contribute at patreon.com/right and learn more about your right to reason at therighttoreason.com. Your activism is appreciated.
And today we're talking to Mark Warren and Matthew Hunsinger. Gentlemen, I'm so happy to be talking to you.
Likewise.
Great to be here.
The topic I wanted to discuss today is consciousness. We've got a psychologist here, and we have a history teacher. And I thought it might be a lot of fun while we're talking about what consciousness is, if that's even something we can even explain. I know I can't. I'm hoping you can help us out there, Matt. But Mark might also be able to kind of tell us how our understanding of psychology, of studying consciousness itself, has kind of changed over the years. I wanted to start off with Dan Dennett.
Most people think consciousness, whatever it is just supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. It's something so wonderful, 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 wonderful that we have to sort of divide the universe in two to make room for it, all on one side, all by itself. And I understand why they think that, and I think it's just wrong. It is wonderful. It's astonishingly wonderful, but it is not a miracle, and it isn't magic. It's a bunch of tricks. And it really is. I like the comparison with magic, because stage magic, of course, is not magic. It's a bunch of tricks. And consciousness is a bunch of tricks in the brain. And we're learning what those tricks are and how they fit together, and why it seems to be so much more than that bunch of tricks. Now, for a lot of people, the very suggestion that might be so is offensive or repugnant. They really don't like that idea. And they view it as an assault, sort of an assault on their dignity or their specialness. And I think that's a prime mistake.
Matthew, why would people find the idea of consciousness being tricks? If you like the way that he worded that, why would they find that offensive?
I mean, that's the first time I've heard that soundbite. It's an interesting one, and I definitely I can see where he's coming from in saying that, and I think part of it is it maybe goes back to the legacy that we got from the dualism legacy that we got from Descartes, where the world was split into the material and the non-material, the non-physical, and for a soul to exist, there has to be something non-physical that exists. So if someone proposes a kind of a biologically reductionistic version of consciousness, then for some people that might feel like a threat. Maybe for them, they feel like, well, then I can't have a soul. I can't have this part of me that's non-physical that can continue to exist. And what does that mean for if they're religious? What does that mean for their religious belief system? So I think that's probably the reason why. I mean, I would imagine, I would predict that there would be more theists that would be offended than atheists that would be offended by that. I imagine most, if not all, atheists would hear that and be like, sure, that makes sense. It's a physical phenomenon. Our nervous system, like consciousness emerges out of our nervous system. We're slowly understanding how that happens, but sure, why wouldn't it emerge out of our nervous system versus being something that exists that is separate from our nervous system, in some way interacts with it, kind of like the way that Descartes talked about it, that the soul, the consciousness was this non-physical property of the universe that interacts with the physical, body that we have through, he thought, the pineal gland.
Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am not. I think, therefore I have developed religion and believe in higher powers that gave me the power to be conscious. Yeah, I prefer the shorter version. I think, therefore I am. But no, I agree completely as far as the theist versus atheist.
Matthew kind of brought up that Descartes kind of got this ball rolling. But Mark, would you say that the idea of thinking of our conscious as separate from our subconscious, that kind of came up a little bit later?
Well, there's the discussion of tabula rasa, the rasa, excuse me, terrible pronunciation on my end on that one. But, essentially the blank slate. Do we come out as a blank slate that you then are writing your own consciousness, or your consciousness is then written? Or are you, if you don't agree with that tabula rasa statement, are you born with, implicit consciousness of some kind? As far as I'm concerned in history, I'm sure it is discussed, but those are two, the cogito ergo sum and Locke's statement of tabula rasa. Those are both very dateable. There again to, Locke died in 1704, so had to have been well before that. So to me, that kind of dates to where I am familiar with the topic. But we have someone that I believe is a wee bit more familiar than myself.
Even if Descartes and Locke were some of the first people to, to name these ideas, right. I imagine that it was part of the zeitgeist, that there was something about the zeitgeist, something about the, ethos that kind of sparked those ideas. I imagine they were ideas that were appealing to people in general, especially given, let's say, with Descartes, because of the importance and the role of the church in society, that someone coming out and saying, what Dennett said, but maybe in different language because it was a different time period, probably would have been very threatening to the church. And who knows, maybe Descartes didn't fully believe that. I mean, it's hard to know the degree to which some of these individuals were saying things because they knew that if they said something different that was considered going against the church, that there could be some pretty intense negative consequences.
Guys, I still don't get why this bothers us, though. Like, I know it bothers me, I just don't know why.
I think there's something else that could be happening with people feeling offended by what Dennett said. And I would say that human beings we have a history of trying to distance ourselves from non-human animal species and not think of ourselves as animals and, put ourselves in this special place in the world and in the universe. So I also wonder if, and this is speculation, I also wonder if that position of consciousness is a natural physical phenomenon, that might be threatening to people in part because it brings us closer to other species. It kind of puts us in the same category in a certain way as other species. And like, if my consciousness emerges from my nervous system, well, that means that there surely could be other species for which they're conscious, and that consciousness emerges from a nervous system that may not be as complex, but is complex enough that they can be conscious. And so I wonder if that also threatens that feeling of specialness that human beings maybe tend to have, and I would say have wanted to have historically, of saying, well, we're human beings, we're civilized, we're not like those primal animals out there in the wild.
And I find it funny now that some of the most popular videos or memes, et cetera, that you find on YouTube are going exactly contrary to that, where people are relating to the animals exactly because they are exhibiting human characteristics. The penguins that walk together because they've been lifelong partners and they share the responsibility of the egg. People are now relating to that, and the exact opposite way that you're saying that we have throughout time, where it's just animals are food, we are humans. They are clearly not conscious, whereas we are. And that divide is now, it seems, kind of going in the reverse direction a little bit, where
right.
People are finding joy in the fact that animals are exhibiting human characteristics.
Right, which I think is great. I think that's great. And I wonder if, like, in the past, the church played a big role, the Christian church played a big role in that divide, because they needed, I would say that Christian theology requires that we think of other species as being separate from us categorically, because we are God's special creation. We are here to look over the earth, to be its landlords, landladies. So you kind of need that divide, versus from the secular humanist perspective, the divide isn't needed at all.
Right.
So I'm going to read from Sam Harris, Waking Up, A Guide to Spirituality Without Religion. And I think he's kind of touching on the point that both of you guys are referring to. He says, obviously, there is something in our experience that we are calling I in quotes. He says, apart from the sheer fact that we are conscious, otherwise we would never describe our subjectivity in the way we do. And a person would have no basis for feeling that she had lost her sense of self, whatever the circumstances. Nevertheless, it is extremely difficult to pinpoint just what it is we take ourselves to be. Many philosophers have noticed this problem, but few in the West have understood that the failure to locate the self can produce more than mere confusion. I suspect that this difference between Eastern and Western philosophy has something to do with the influence of Abrahamic religion and its doctrine of the soul. Christianity in particular presents impressive obstacles to thinking intelligently about the nature of the human mind, asserting as it does the real existence of individual souls who are subject to the eternal judgment of God. I kind of feel like that's kind of backpacking on what you guys were saying, where it's just the way that we think of consciousness as maybe like, I'm not just a hunk of meat being led around by a skeleton. Like there's a me back there behind these eyes looking out. Like what you were referencing maybe in terms of dualism.
You know, again, having taught prehistory until the Renaissance, you talk about, you know, Icemen and tribalism and things that predate organized religion that we're aware of. I mean, that's not to say that it wasn't extant on some level, you know, priest, shaman, what have you. But to a one, every single one of my classes has always asked, because, you know, they fairly, to a number of them, monotheistic Christian practicing students, they ask, when did God become God? Yeah, and not in those words necessarily, but when did the consciousness shift from we are here on this planet as animals to we are here on this planet as, if not obviously dominant at the time, higher thinking animals, which then turns to when did religion begin, so to speak. So at that point, I guess even, you know, we refer to, you know, Descartes and Locke earlier as tangible points in history of where this consciousness of self versus potential others, you know, or others, you know, superhuman being, God or what have you. When did that begin? I mean, the type of burials that, you know, become very ritualistic, that to me implies that you have at least a belief in honoring the dead, which implies that you continue thinking about the dead after they're gone. To me, that symbolizes consciousness of, you know, a pretty high caliber. So again, we've talked about not being able to cite exactly when the, you know, names of these ideas began. But to me, I mean, those students asking me that question kind of leads me to think, okay, perhaps consciousness began very, very early in human history, and we just didn't have any way of recording it.
A very basic level of awareness and subjectivity probably first evolved during the Cambrian period. So that's like 500 million years ago. So it could be that it's possible that human beings are kind of distant ancestors. I guess I know Homo sapiens or where we are, and you know the kind of iterations before that they could have had a very basic level of awareness and subjectivity that you know is very not as rich as what we have today, but it's certainly a level of subjectivity that would be enough for us to say, like, yes, consciousness exists there. So the more we learn, the farther back in time it seems that it's likely to go in our history, but also in the history of other species on this planet.
If that's true, we're looking at 541 to 485.4 million years ago.
Yeah.
Jesus.
So I was arguing, you know, early humans, if that's true, or at least in theory true, yikes, that goes back way further.
Well, I had this dude, he was this anthropologist called Bernie Taylor. One of the more fascinating conversations I've ever had. He was on the podcast that was, it was Cave Culture, I think it was 108. But he was saying that we've got cave drawings that map out the stars and all the animals that was 40,000 years ago.
Ötzi the Iceman being the, I guess, still, unless you count Lucy as, you know, the pre-human, but the first recognizably human that we have record of and good condition. I believe we actually used him in reference in the last time I was on your show. The Iceman is
the dude with the arrow in his back.
3345 BCE. So we're talking 5,000 years ago for something that we would recognize as human. So you were saying 50,000 years?
Yeah.
So
he was referencing, I think, 40. That's insane. That's okay. What is consciousness exactly? Like, it's kind of hard for me to define it. I like to think of it as just like I know that I am doing the things I'm doing. Is that fair?
I think so. I mean, I would say that there are multiple layers and levels of consciousness, and there are different scholars who have different different ways of talking about those different levels, but I think they all come down to the same thing. I mean, I think it becomes kind of a semantic differences versus, big conceptual differences. But for example, we have what we could call like a very basic or core level of consciousness. And that is just, it feels like something to be us. It's just a basic level of subjectivity and awareness. And it, when we're awake or when we're dreaming, it feels like something to be alive. For human beings and other species, and I'm not enough of an expert in comparative psychology to say which species have this additional layer of consciousness, but then there's this kind of extended additional layer of consciousness that's kind of what we call in psychology metacognition, which is the ability to reflect on our own experience. Like I can say, not only does it feel like something to be Matthew Hunsinger right now, but I can reflect on that and say, oh, well, I'm feeling calm, and I'm excited to be having this conversation with the two of you, but maybe a few hours later, like I feel really anxious, and I think this is why I'm feeling anxious, right? We can reflect on our subjectivity, our subjective experience, but before that is just a subjective experience, which we get to experience when we're in what psychologists call a flow state, right? Like if you're like, Robert, don't you play music? Don't you play guitar? No.
I wish I did.
Okay. Well, I mean, there are certain things that we can do. I mean, when we're meditating, when we're playing music, when we're dancing, I mean, there's certain times when we can get into like a flow state where the self kind of melts into the background and we are just immersed in that experiential activity, in that experience. And
like in sex, maybe?
Yeah, sex is definitely a time when the self kind of melts away and we are totally absorbed and focused in that experience. And so when we're having sex and we're totally absorbed, like that is a basic level of consciousness. And then when we start commenting internally on the experience, that's when that kind of extended layer kicks in. But the extended layer also, I would say, part of that is what some scholars call the autobiographical self, which is the fact that our self is a story that stretches out over time. And to do that, we need long-term memory, right? Because we need to be able to link the past to the present and link the present to the future. And we can't do that without long-term memory. If we had only short-term memory and all of our memories lasted just a few minutes, our self would only last a few minutes in terms of the continuity across time. So that's what I would say that consciousness is, that it feels like something to be you. And then there are additional layers of consciousness and experience kind of layered on top of that. I don't know if that helps, Robert, or answers your...
And I like the fact that you use the word experience, because I think a lot of people have a hard time whenever you say, the age-old adage, what is it like to be a bat, right? And somebody goes, well, I mean, what's it like? I mean, what's it like to be a chair? It's like something to be a rock. It's like something to be a tree. And you're like, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, what is the bat's experience? And whenever we think of consciousness that way, I think it makes a little bit more sense. It's at least now we can start to explain this thing whenever we think of it in terms of experience rather than in terms of being. And I wonder, Jung kind of referenced something that I want to read to you guys, and it's the part of us that's darkness, as it were. He refers to it as the shadow in his book Archetype, Shadow, Anima, and Animus. Well, let me preface it by saying Jung has this dream. He was accompanied by a small brown-skinned savage who initiated a killing. Sounds like Jung was a racist. But anyway, he believed that this shadow was the embodiment of the primitive. He says, here I quote, "By shadow, I mean the negative side of the personality, the sum of all those unpleasant qualities we like to hide, together with the insufficiently developed functions and the contents of the personal unconscious." Mark, tell me about Jung a little bit, man. What kind of guy was he?
Sure. So the basic divide between, again, the one that you classically compare Jung to is Freud. But Jung by himself, he divided the psyche into three basic parts: the ego, which goes along with Freud at the time, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious. The ego is the conscious, and the personal unconscious includes memories that are both recalled and, suppressed. And the collective unconscious holds our experience as a species or knowledge that we are both with. For example, love at first sight. Jung's take on the human psyche was inspired by his studies in Eastern philosophy and religion such as Buddhism and Hinduism. He also believed that the contents of the unconscious are not restricted to repressed material. Our consciousness is affected not only from the id, the ego, and the superego, as Freud had stated, and we are affected by our consciousness as it is affected by these outside factors as well.
So here's, I know Matthew's favorite guy, Jordan Peterson. I'm just kidding. But here was his take on the shadow, what Jung was referring to as like the dark side of the mind, as it were.
I haven't read anyone I regard as deeper than Jung. He's terrifying, truly terrifying. But here's one of the things that differentiates him from the typical self-help person. I really love this, is that he believes that the pathway to completion as a human being is through the embodiment of the monster. You see, because there's a big difference between someone who's naive and is a good person. They're naive, they're a good person because they can't not be. They're like a domesticated house cat. There's nothing, they don't even have the capacity to be bad. So there's no morality in that. The morality comes when you're a monster and you can control it. And that's the Jungian encounter with the shadow. So Jung said, for example, that the roots of the shadow go all the way down to hell. And what he meant by that is that you can think about it literally, you can think about it metaphorically. We'll just think about it metaphorically. It's like, if you start to understand who you are, then you understand the Nazis. And who wants to understand the Nazis? You know, I can understand sex criminals. I can understand them. Right. I can understand Nazis. And the reason for that is because I can see that as an aspect of myself.
Probably a good spot to step in.
No, that's a great point. Just to talk of group effervescence directly, from several of the readings that as a historian I've done on Nazis, a lot of times you can't really differentiate in the books from the history. From that point, just the group effervescence aspect that I think he was referring to in his, I won't call it a rant necessarily, but his discussion. That's an interesting point for me, yeah.
Is that a possibility that there could be something like the shadow inside our consciousness?
Yeah, I guess the way I think about it is that we all come into this world with a certain temperament, and then we're immersed in a social environment. And so, I don't believe anyone is born evil, but I do believe that people can be born with certain kinds of temperament or tendencies that, given the right social environment, can push them in a direction of acting in ways that we call evil. And then obviously, as we get older, we're as moral agents, we start to make choices about how we're going to treat others, and are we going to move towards cultivating compassion towards others and towards the self, or are we going to move in other directions. But I do think that I would say that the shadow self is just that we, human beings, that we are wired for the ability to be violent, to be destructive, to be a whole number of negative and destructive things, and a very complex interaction between what we come into the world with genetically and our social environment, and then the choices that we make as we move through our lifespan. That those things can either cause the shadow self to amplify and to have a bigger impact on our behavior, or we recognize that shadow self exists, and we work with it. This idea that there's a shadow self doesn't just exist in Western thought. For example, in Native American, or let's say a non-indigenous Western thought, like in Native American tradition, there's a story of the two wolves where we have two wolves within us, and so one is the shadow self essentially, and the other one is the more compassionate self. And so basically the story is that, well, it depends on which one you feed. Like the one you feed is the one that will come out more. So this is something that Jung thought about, but he's not the only one who thought about this. That other people in other traditions have recognized that there are these different parts of ourselves. And then I also, as I was hearing that soundbite, I was also thinking about and what Mark said. I was thinking about Milgram's research, his seminal research in psychology that happened after World War II, because he was trying to understand how could a country of people, do this. And so he took, for your listeners who are not familiar with the Milgram study, he took a bunch of just people in the community, just, average Joe, average Jane people in the community.
Most of them, I think, were World War II vets.
Were they? Okay. I didn't know that. Interesting.
Or at least many of them that made it on the video of the Milgram experiments, which are 7 hours long and dull for about 6, but an hour of them is solid work.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that about the sample. So, right, that just makes it more interesting and illuminating the findings. So basically what Milgram did is he said, okay, brought people into the study and they all became the teachers, and they didn't know they were working with someone working with the experimenter, but they thought there was this other participant who was going to learn these, learn information, had to repeat it back, and then they would deliver a shock whenever the person didn't respond correctly. And so people were basically doing what they thought was delivering shocks that would be lethal, like up to 450 volt shocks to someone. And at certain points, the person, as far as they understood, stopped responding. And so they had to keep going. And many of them did keep going and kept delivering shocks because they were told, well, a non-response is a wrong answer, so you need to keep going. And people, so that helps us understand, well, how could a nation of people, presumably some of whom are not evil, I mean, there are people who in that group who are, what any of us would call evil individuals who are willing to do horrible things to, their fellow human beings. But there are plenty of people in Germany at the time during World War II who were the same as us, no more evil than we are. So I think that, I do think that the shadow stuff is part of consciousness. And I think part of it ultimately comes maybe from these parts of our nervous system that are geared towards doing what feels good and getting what we want and surviving.
Well, I mean, it's essentially coming up with a system, and at some point you have to put that system over the individual. So whenever we're talking about the Nazis, they were putting a system over individual Jews, right? And it's the same idea that we do it all the time. I mean, take gun control, for instance. Both sides have a certain amount of applying a system or a solution over top of the individual, where you say, well, I don't want these kids to get shot in school, so I want to take your guns away. Well, that's a good system. It sounds pretty reasonable. Let's at least get some sensible regulations in place. Okay. But what about if someone breaks in my house and I want to defend myself and I go for that gun and it's not there and that guy kills me? At some point, the person proposing this solution, from a good place, mind you, I'm sure, but they're proposing the solution is going to have to go, yeah, okay. But I mean, that's a small price to pay. And then you turn that coin over and you say, oh, well, what about we should keep our gun rights? And you're like, yeah, but these kids are getting shot up in schools. There's all these mass shootings. That's a major problem. You go, yeah, well, those don't happen that often. And that's a small price to pay for my Second Amendment rights. Like, both sides are coming up with a system and putting it over the person, I feel like. And I think we do that with democracy itself. The whole concept of democracy is taking a system and putting it over top of other people. Because without the Bill of Rights, for example, every minority would always be suffering from the concept of democracy.
To be part of a democratic society, you as an individual, make the conscious decision to allow, the majority rule concept to dictate certain aspects of your life. You are conscious of this decision and you are a conscious participant in that.
No, I think it's a great metaphor. In fact, it makes me think of the debate in psychology that's ongoing, and the debate that's been happening in philosophy for a long time about free will, agency. Do we have it? Because now, I mean, I'm assuming the two of you are familiar with some of the research that's come out in psychology around just the ways in which our unconscious mind has an impact on us, or we know that our unconscious mind knows that we're going to do something before we know we're going to do it consciously, that kind of stuff. But there have been some social psychologists who've argued that our agency, it's not a free will, but will agency comes through in the fact that we can regulate our automaticity to some degree. There are these automatic responses that come up, and our agency is manifest in terms of that if we have the awareness of something and we have the cognitive resources to regulate it, that we can, which I think relates to what you're saying, Robert, that we have systems in place to try and govern human behavior. So there's kind of a system that is there to kind of oversee and regulate behaviors across individuals. And I would say that our consciousness does kind of work in that same way, that our conscious mind to some degree can help us regulate what's coming out of our unconscious mind. Yeah,
it seems like no matter what you do, consciousness leads to that free will discussion. Would you guys be cool if maybe in the future you could come back on and we could kind of dig into this free will in the same way we dug into consciousness today?
Absolutely.
Sure.
Mark, Matthew, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate this.
Hey, very much my pleasure. Anytime.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was great.
Thank you to Mark and Matthew. Thank you to Dave Blair at davefreesong.com/free music. Thank you to our patrons, Alan Marks, Bernard Lamberell, Enema Man, Freethinker 215, Gregoria, Kevin Francis from the Left at the Valley podcast, Larry Wilson, My Humble Assault, Patrick Walsh, Phil Calderon from Believers and Non-Believers in Discussion, Philip Spawn, another Philip, and yet another Philip, lots of Phillips, Rob Montgomery, our top dog contributor. Thanks, Rob. Sean Yankee, Susie Boardman, Tara, the Odd Atheist Friends, that's Eric Ryder and Matthew Maxim, and finally Thomas. You also can support this broadcast at patreon.com/right and learn more at therighttoreason.com. Next week, we're going to host a debate between a Trump supporter and Ben Fama Jr. This will be bold, harsh, and disrespectful and make you pity the Trump supporter. I'm just making a prediction because I know Ben and how he operates. He doesn't use a scalpel. He uses a goddamn hammer. Between now and then, remember that you have the right to reason.